Hello, welcome to Miss Peepers Reading Corner. I'm Katrina, aka Miss Peepers. Let's talk about books. Today we're going to talk about one of my absolute favorite books, which you can't see because I don't have the dust jacket, but that is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Now, before I get into what this book is about, I do want to start with content warnings because some of these topics, as I talk about the book, I'm going to talk about that content as well. As always, with any book, if there are topics that you prefer to avoid or just know about going in for any reason, please look after yourself. Check into each book yourself. If I don't mention it, that doesn't mean it's not in there. I'm human just like you, so I called out the things that struck me as content warnings, but that may not apply to everybody. So, content warnings for this book: suicide and self-harm, violence, mental illness, and abuses of power by law enforcement. All right, so what is this book about? This is set in a dystopian future in which books are banned to the nth degree. They're not just not allowed. If you are caught with a book of any kind, the book is burned and you will be arrested and possibly even executed or put into a mental institution, because the society believes that there must be something wrong with your mental state if you have a book. So instead of reading, the populace is expected to drown all of their thoughts, their worries, in sleeping pills, in wall-sized TVs, in constant radio or music, constant sound, and basically you're just drowning everything. It's unusual to stop for a quiet moment and do something as simple as look up at the sky or appreciate a flower or just see the people around you. Our protagonist in this book is a man called Guy Montag. He is a firefighter, but because buildings have been built now to be entirely resistant to fire, his job is not to put fires out, but rather to start them. That is, he is a book burner. And this is a role that is part of law enforcement in this society. At the beginning of the novel, Montag, like everyone around him, isn't particularly questioning of his job or the world at large, the way that society is set up. But after a few interactions, first with his teenage neighbor, Clarice, who asks him some uncomfortable questions, including, "Are you happy?" Initially, he thinks, well, of course I'm happy. Then later, when he's on a job, Montag steals a book. He just, on an impulse, picks it up, sticks it in his pocket. Then he reads the book. Then he starts to think for himself, which is something that you don't do in this society. This book is about questioning the status quo. It's also about censorship, and it's also about the beauty of language to tell stories. It's about education, and ultimately, of course, it is about a love of books. So why is this one of my absolute favorites? Well, I love books and I hate censorship. If you watch my video about why people aren't reading anymore, I went on a little bit of a tirade about censorship in that, and then it just so happens that my birthday falls right at the end of Banned Books Week every year. So that's in October, so there will be some content then. I love books, I hate censorship, so of course Bradbury and I are on the same wavelength there. The writing is simple and straightforward, but it's also quite beautiful in its simplicity. And then on top of that, yes, it is about a love of books, but Bradbury acknowledges very openly in this book that books are not the only way to tell a good story, and they're not the only medium through which you can share thoughts and ideas. Later in the novel, Montag is speaking with Faber, a revolutionary, and Faber is telling him about what books used to be, history that has been essentially erased from the public memory. And he talks about the magic of books and the magic of stories and ideas. And he says, "It's not books you need. It's some of the things that once were in books. The same things could be in the parlor families today. The same infinite detail and awareness could be projected through the radios and televisors, but are not. No, it's not books at all you're looking for. Take it where you can find it, in old phonograph records, old motion pictures, and in old friends. Look for it in nature and look for it in yourself. Books were only one type of receptacle where we stored a lot of things we were afraid we might forget. There's nothing magical in them at all. The magic is only in what the books say, how they stitch the patches of the universe together into one garment for us. And I think the key of that line is really important. It's obviously, I love books. I love physical books. I own a lot of physical books, and I read them all the time. That's why I have a booktube channel. But I've long said that what I really love is stories. I love adaptations. I love movies. I love TV shows. I love video games, whether they're original stories or adaptations of books. There's so many rich stories and beautiful things to be found in all sorts of media. Books are a great one. Books are amazing. Love books. And I think it's really telling that Bradbury, who himself was very much a lover of books, of course he was also a writer of books, that he loved other types of stories as well, and didn't confine himself just to the written word. Now, some of the context of this book, of course, censorship, banned books, challenging books has always been a thing. It's always been in place for as long as we've had books. People who are in power and feel insecure in that power are often always on the lookout for ideas that they perceive as dangerous to them, and their goal is to squish it, to squash it, whether it's a religious authority, a governmental authority, or even an individual in an organization or a household. That censorship of ideas is a very real and ever-present thing. And Ray Bradbury, as an author, of course, was very aware of this. This book was first published in 1951 and, of course, has been released in a number of editions since then. A little more on that later. And my edition happens to have a couple of the introductions from various previous editions in which Bradbury tells the story of how he wrote this book and why he wrote it. So I'll read a bit from that here. These are Bradbury's own words. What caused my inspiration? There had to be a root system of influence, yes, that propelled me to dive headfirst into my typewriter and come up dripping with hyperbole, metaphor, and similes about fire, print, and papyrus. Of course. There was Hitler torching books in Germany in 1934, rumors of Stalin and his match people in tinderboxes, plus long ago the witch hunts in Salem in 1680, where my 10 times great-grandmother Mary Bradbury was tried but escaped the burning. But most of it was my romantic background in Roman, Greek, and Egyptian mythology starting at the age of 3. Yes, 3 years old, 3, when Tut was first raised from his tomb and appeared in the weekend news gazettes in all his gold panoply, and I wondered what he was and asked my folks. So it was inevitable that I would hear or read about the triple burnings of the Alexandrian library, 2 of which were accidental, 1 on purpose. Knowing this at 9, I wept. For, strange child that I was already an inhabitant of the high attics and haunted basements of the Carnegie Library in Waukegan, Illinois. And he goes on to talk about how he spent so much of his childhood in and out of libraries. When his family would travel, he would find the local library wherever they ended up. And even later, his family could not afford to send him to college, and so he educated himself in the library. He sought out books and learned everything that he could, and of course became quite successful. And Bradbury even wrote Fahrenheit 451 itself in a number of iterations, first as short stories, getting longer, and eventually turning into the book that we have today. And he wrote the majority of this novel in a library, on a rented typewriter, which at that time required you to physically put dimes into the machine to keep it going. And the dollar amounts vary, but it sounds like he spent just under $10 just renting the typewriter time to write this story. And he would type, and then he'd run upstairs to look something up and come back down and write some more, get a quote, get an idea, get a title of a book, whatever he needed for the story, and just kept on writing over the course of about 9 days, which is quite impressive, although he had this story rattling around in his brain quite a bit before he actually sat down to write the novella version of this book and then later to lengthen it into a full novel. Now, a fun fact about this book about censorship is that it has been the subject of many challenges and bans over the years. It was even one of the books burned, actually burned in during the apartheid in South Africa, along, of course, with other books as well. One of my favorite stories about the book, which still blows my mind. So in 1967, Ballantine Books was the publisher. This edition is actually by Simon and Schuster, which I don't think is a coincidence. In 1967, Ballantine Books was the publisher of Fahrenheit 451, and they released an expurgated edition of this book for high school students. Now, if you don't know, expurgated is just a fancy word for censored. They took out words that they considered to be offensive, words like damn, hell, and abortion, and made it appropriate for a high school audience. And they even edited out an addition, a reference to a drunk man, referring to him as a sick man. I know it was the 60s, but come on, people. Anyway, they did this entirely without Bradbury's knowledge. They didn't ask him, they didn't tell him. And it wasn't until 10 years later, a friend of Bradbury's got a hold of an edition, saw that it was changed, and brought it to him and asked him about it. It's like, what happened? Bradbury was, of course, pissed. And no, I will not censor that word. He was pissed, understandably so. And of course, put a stop to that. That edition is no longer being published. I'm sure you can get copies of it. They're probably worth something, quite a bit now. But then he wrote a coda in the next edition of the book, in the 1979 edition of the book, and I'm going to read this from my computer screen. I don't have that edition of the book, sadly, but with the power of the internet, I have, I was able to pull some quotations from it. So Bradbury wrote, "There's more than one way to burn a book, and the world is full of people running about with lit matches," which I adore. And then later in the same coda, and you can tell he was mad, he wrote, "Every dimwit editor who sees himself as the source of all dreary blancmange, plain porridge, unleavened literature, licks his guillotine and eyes the neck of any author who dares to speak above a whisper or write above a nursery rhyme." So yeah, he was mad. And quite frankly, I don't blame him. I know there's a lot of discussion these days about books being changed after their initial publishing. Like recently, Roald Dahl published updated versions of some of his own books, which I understand. At least that's the author saying, yeah, I wrote some things that are definitely offensive. Didn't realize it at the time, realize it now, rewriting. I don't want to go too much off on a tangent. I think it's very different when the author themselves chooses to rewrite or update their own books. Agatha Christie's novels have gone through a number of iterations. There's quite a bit in the original that is just not appropriate. For example, the very famous and actually quite beloved novel by Agatha Christie, And Then There Were None, was edited multiple times. The original was 10 little N-word. So, you know. So that's not unknown for books to be censored for various reasons. I have mixed feelings about the Agatha Christie because she was not around to make that decision. And I do think we kind of, though I love Christie's books, like her stories are so imaginative, that does not change the fact that she was racist, and had another number of problematic beliefs. But to rewrite the book or to edit the book so that you can publish it to a different audience or give off a certain vibe, I don't like it. I don't like it, especially with the when the author is no longer with us, it feels just like a cash grab on the part of the publisher or possibly the estate. In Christie's case, I'm not actually sure which that is, but regardless, they go, well, we can't publish it with this racial slur in the title, so we'll publish it with something else. And actually, that particular book went through a couple of iterations before it got to a title, and then there were none, which is considered non-offensive now. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit. I could probably do an entirely separate video on just the editing of books. I'd have to do some research because I'm not an expert on it, but I will say this. When you are editing a book for the sake of making it more palatable to a particular group of people, you are then erasing the original meaning of that book, and you're obscuring what might be problematic about an author. I think in general circles, people don't think of Agatha Christie as racist because that has been erased. While you can read a book without considering the context and the author, it's never fully separate from that. And so to rewrite a book for whatever sensibilities, I happen to disagree with the idea that words like hell, damn, and abortion, and even drunk are offensive. I don't find them offensive terms, but that's me. You might, and that's perfectly fine. We're going to be on different wavelengths there, and that's okay. But I think what's important is to say you can choose not to read a book if it offends you, and that is fine. But to rewrite a book so you can teach it in schools, and that's a publisher rewriting a book so they can sell more copies to a bunch of high schools and make it part of the curriculum. And it's just ironic considering that this book is about censorship and about preventing people from reading things that are considered offensive. So yeah, censorship ticks me off so much. Hate it, hate it, hate it. Which honestly is why it's one of the main themes, why it's one of the main themes of one of my favorite books. So of course, censorship is a huge theme of this book. Education, just collecting knowledge, not necessarily formal education, but just collecting knowledge is an important theme in this book. And of course, questioning the status quo, as I've mentioned. Another theme within this book is leaving your mark on the world. Everyone must leave something behind when he dies, my grandfather said. A child or a book or a painting or a house or a wall built or a pair of shoes made or a garden planted. Something your hand touched some way, so your soul has somewhere to go when you die. And when people look at that tree or that flower you planted, you're there. It doesn't matter what you do, he said, so long as you change something from the way it was before you touched it into something that's like you after you take your hands away. The difference between a man who just cuts lawns and a real gardener is in the touching, he said. The lawn cutter might just as well not have been there at all. The gardener will be there a lifetime. That's one of my favorite lines from this book. I adore that message that when you do something, when you touch something, you should leave a bit of yourself behind. You don't have to do something huge to leave your mark on the world. And then a theme throughout the entire book also is what it means to be happy. That's something that Montague doesn't even consider until Clarice asks him that question, are you happy? And his first thought is, well, of course I am. And then he realizes that, in fact, he hasn't thought about it and he's not. He has a wife who is clearly depressed and just completely absent from the physical world. She's constantly on the TV screens, listening to the radio, listening to the music, 24/7. And he realizes that what he wants is something else, and he goes to seek it. Now, I love a distraction. I've mentioned books can be a distraction, video games, movies, all of that. YouTube can be a distraction, but it's also important to stop and contemplate what's going on in your life and whether it's the life that you want or whether you're doing the things that you want to do. Everyone should check in with themselves on that. Now, this is essentially a book review, or it's meant to be a bit of a book ramble, but the question at the end of a review is always, should you read this book? I think I've made my views pretty clear. This is my favorite book, so of course I think everyone should read it, unexpurgated. Though the expurgated version could be kind of interesting to see. This book is beautiful and lovely, and I will never tell anyone that they shouldn't read it. So let me know in the comments, have you read Fahrenheit 451 or other books by Ray Bradbury, and what did you think of them? And either way, I will see you in the next one.